On the morning of February 18, 1957, a Kenyan man walked toward a gallows inside Kimathi prison. His name was Dedan Kimathi. To the British colonial government, he was a dangerous rebel. To many Kenyans, he was a freedom fighter. And decades later, he would become a national hero. But there is something strange about his story. Kimathi died in 1957. Kenya became independent in 1963. So how did a man who died before independence become one of the symbols of the country that came after him? To understand Dedan Kimathi, we have to go back to a Kenya that looked very different from the one we know today. Dedan Kimathi Wasuri was born on October 31, 1920, in what was then the Nyeri district of British Kenya. He grew up during colonial rule, in a society where land, political power, and opportunity were deeply unequal. Kimathi's father died before he was born, and education became an important part of his early life. He attended school as a teenager, became known for his English and his debating ability, and later worked a series of jobs. He even briefly served in the British military during the Second World War. But the young man who once served within the colonial system would eventually become one of its most determined enemies. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened as Kenya's political tensions intensified. For many Africans in colonial Kenya, the question was simple. Who owned the land? European settlers had acquired large areas of some of Kenya's most fertile territory, while many Africans faced restrictions, taxation, labor demands, and political exclusion. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, nationalist politics was growing. Kimathi became involved with the Kenya African Union. But alongside constitutional politics, another movement was developing. It would become known as Mau Mau. The movement's name would later be used by the colonial government as a label for a broad insurgency. But at its core were demands that could be expressed in two words: land and freedom. In October 1952, the British colonial government declared a state of emergency. The conflict that followed became one of the most violent episodes of Britain's retreat from empire. Mau Mau fighters attacked colonial targets, settlers, and Africans they regarded as collaborators. The colonial government responded with military operations, mass arrests, detention, and forced resettlement. The conflict was not a simple battle between two armies. It became a war fought through villages, forests, farms, and detention camps. And in the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares, Dedan Kimathi emerged as one of the movement's most important commanders. He was not simply a fighter. Kimathi tried to give the forest movement political and military organization. He helped develop structures through which the fighters could coordinate their activities. He also understood the importance of documenting the struggle. Kimathi understood something important. A war could be lost on the battlefield, but its story could still survive. For the British authorities, Kimathi became a priority target. The colonial government portrayed Mau Mau as a terrorist threat and used extensive security operations to destroy the insurgency. The scale of the response was enormous. Modern scholarship estimates that around 80,000 people were detained during the emergency, while approximately 1.2 million Kenyans were forcibly resettled. And the violence was not one-sided. Thousands of Africans were killed by Mau Mau, including people accused of supporting the colonial government. European civilians were also killed. But British forces and colonial authorities were responsible for widespread detention and documented abuses, including torture and ill-treatment. The war had become a struggle in which ordinary Kenyans were caught between competing forces. And Kimathi was now one of the most wanted men in Kenya. For 4 years, Kimathi remained in the forests. Then, in October 1956, the hunt ended. Kimathi was captured after being shot in the leg. The man who had spent years evading one of the most powerful empires in the world was now a prisoner. But his war was not quite over. Now it would move from the forest to the courtroom. On November 19, 1956, Dedan Kimathi appeared before the Supreme Court of Kenya at Nyeri. He entered a plea of not guilty. The trial lasted 8 days. And here, the historical record becomes particularly important. Later accounts sometimes describe Kimathi as being tried for treason. But the surviving trial transcript shows that the conviction concerned the unlawful possession of a firearm and ammunition. He was sentenced to death. His appeal failed. For the colonial government, the capture and conviction of Kimathi represented a major victory. For his supporters, it created something else. A martyr. Early on February 18, 1957, Dedan Kimathi was hanged at Kamite prison. He was 36 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. And the exact location of his remains has never been conclusively established. The colonial government had killed the man. But it could not control what his death would mean. Because Kimathi's execution came at a moment when the colonial system itself was beginning to change. Kimathi did not live to see the Kenyan flag raised. He did not hear Jomo Kenyatta become Prime Minister. He did not stand in Nairobi when Kenya became independent on December 12, 1963. But the struggle he had participated in had changed the political landscape permanently. The Mau Mau uprising had been militarily defeated. But Britain could no longer simply return Kenya to the colonial status quo. Political negotiations accelerated. African representation expanded. And eventually, independence came. 6 years after Kimathi's execution, the country he had fought to transform became a sovereign nation. 4 years after independence, Kimathi's place in Kenya's official history remained complicated. The memory of Mau Mau was politically uncomfortable. But the story changed. In 2007, 50 years after his execution, a statue of Dedan Kimathi was unveiled in central Nairobi. The man once hunted by the colonial government was now standing in the heart of the capital. A rifle in one hand. A dagger in the other. And a nation that had once been ruled by Britain now standing around him. It was more than a monument. It was a reversal of memory. Dedan Kimathi's legacy is not simple. The Mau Mau movement committed violence. The colonial government committed violence. Thousands of Kenyans died. Thousands more were detained or displaced. And the history of the emergency cannot honestly be reduced to heroes and villains without acknowledging the people caught in between. But Kimathi's significance goes beyond the battlefield. He represents a generation that refused to accept colonial rule as permanent. He was captured. He was tried. He was executed. But the idea he represented survived him. Dedan Kimathi died believing that Kenya could be free. He never saw that freedom. But 6 years after his death, Kenya became independent. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of his story. The British could capture the man. They could put him on trial. They could hang him. They could hide his grave. But they could not bury the question that men like Kimathi had forced Kenya to confront. Who owns the land? Who controls the country? And who has the right to be free? Dedan Kimathi's life ended at a gallows. But his name survived. And today, in independent Kenya, the man once called a rebel by the colonial government stands in history as a symbol of the struggle for freedom. Dedan Kimathi. 1920 to 1957. The war ended. The memory did not.